Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In March of 1998, on a seemingly ordinary afternoon in Frankfurt, Germany, 13-year-old Tristan Brübach walked through a busy train station underpass. Within hours, he would become the victim of one of Germany's most horrific and baffling murders. What makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of the crime, it's that it happened in broad daylight, in a public space, with multiple witnesses seeing the likely killer. Yet somehow, even with DNA evidence and hundreds of leads, the murderer vanished without a trace. Tonight, we'll dive into the mysterious case that has haunted German investigators for over 2 decades. This is the story of Tristan Brübach. On a cold spring afternoon in Frankfurt, Germany, March 26, 1998, a day that should have been like any other turned into one of the most horrific and perplexing criminal cases in German history. 13-year-old Tristan Brübach left school around 1:30 p.m., making his way through the streets of Frankfurt-Höchst, a western district of Frankfurt am Main. The young teenager, known for his quiet demeanor and love of computers, was wearing a dark blue jacket, blue jeans, and carrying his typical school backpack. What makes this case particularly haunting is that Tristan's murder occurred in broad daylight, during hours when people were going about their daily routines. The location where his body would later be found, an underpass near the Frankfurt-Höchst train station, was a regularly traversed area. This wasn't some remote location where crimes typically occur under the cover of darkness. This was a public space during the busiest hours of the day. Tristan's life before that fateful day was relatively ordinary for a German teenager in the late 1990s. He lived with his father, Bernd Brübach, in a modest apartment in Frankfurt-Höchst. His mother had passed away from cancer when he was just 3 years old, leaving father and son to forge a close bond through the years. Despite the early loss of his mother, those who knew Tristan described him as a resilient young man who, though somewhat introverted, maintained a small circle of close friends. At school, Tristan was known to be an average student who particularly excelled in computer classes. His teachers would later recall that he showed great potential in technical subjects, often helping other students with computer-related problems. He had recently started talking about his dreams of working in information technology, a field that was rapidly growing in the late 1990s. The morning of March 26th began normally enough. Tristan attended his classes at the local school, and according to his classmates, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He participated in discussions and went about his day as usual. At approximately 1:30 p.m., when classes ended, Tristan left school. This would be the last time his teachers and classmates would see him alive. Several witnesses reported seeing Tristan in various locations around Frankfurt-Höchst between 1:30 p.m. and 3:20 p.m. He was spotted at a local kebab shop where he bought his lunch, a detail confirmed by the receipt later found in his pocket. Another witness saw him near the train station, walking in the direction of the underpass, where he would meet his tragic end. The most crucial sighting came at approximately 3:20 p.m., when multiple witnesses observed Tristan talking to an unknown man near the entrance to the underpass. The man was described as being in his early to mid-20s, approximately 175 to 180 centimeters tall, with a slim build and dark hair. He was wearing a camouflage jacket and carrying what appeared to be a plastic bag. This would be the last time Tristan was seen alive. At 3:45 p.m., barely 25 minutes after the last sighting, 3 teenagers making their way through the underpass made a horrifying discovery. They found Tristan's body in a maintenance room adjacent to the pedestrian tunnel. The scene that greeted them was so gruesome that they immediately fled and contacted the police. When investigators arrived at the scene, they were confronted with one of the most brutal crimes they had ever encountered. Tristan had been subjected to unimaginable violence. The killer had not only taken his life, but had mutilated his body in ways that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The medical examiner would later determine that Tristan had been strangled, and his throat had been cut with surgical precision. But what made the crime even more disturbing were the post-mortem mutilations performed on the body. The killer had removed specific parts of Tristan's anatomy with what appeared to be expert knowledge of human physiology. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with medical training, or at least significant knowledge of human anatomy. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. It showed signs of planning and a disturbing level of expertise. The crime scene itself provided both valuable evidence and perplexing questions. The killer had left behind the plastic bag that witnesses had earlier observed him carrying. Inside were traces of blood and other forensic evidence that would later prove crucial to the investigation. However, despite the public location and the time of day, no one had heard or seen anything suspicious during the actual commission of the crime. The investigation team, led by the Frankfurt Police Department's Homicide Division, immediately launched one of the largest manhunts in the region's history. They conducted hundreds of interviews, collected numerous pieces of evidence, and pursued every possible lead. The case garnered significant media attention, not only in Germany but across Europe, due to its brutal nature and the fact that it occurred in such a public place during daylight hours. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the abundance of witness sightings, but the lack of concrete evidence leading to a suspect. Multiple people had seen Tristan with the unknown man, yet descriptions varied slightly, and no one could provide enough detail for a definitive composite sketch. The police did create several versions based on witness accounts, but none led to a positive identification. The forensic evidence collected at the scene was extensive. The killer had left behind DNA traces, fingerprints, and other biological evidence. However, in 1998, DNA testing was not as advanced as it is today, and despite having this evidence, investigators were unable to find a match in any available database. The precision of the mutilations led investigators to consider that the perpetrator might have medical training, and they investigated hundreds of medical students, doctors, and other healthcare professionals in the region. But these inquiries led nowhere. As the investigation continued, detectives discovered that several witnesses had reported seeing a man matching the suspect's description in the area in the days leading up to the murder. This suggested that the killer might have been stalking the area, possibly looking for potential victims. This information led investigators to believe that Tristan might not have been specifically targeted, but rather became a victim of opportunity. The community of Frankfurt-Höchst was deeply affected by the crime. Parents became fearful of letting their children walk to school alone, and the underpass where Tristan was murdered, once a busy thoroughfare, became nearly deserted. Local businesses reported a decrease in foot traffic, and the area around the train station took on an almost ghostly atmosphere in the weeks following the murder. Tristan's father, Tristan Brübach, was devastated by the loss of his only child. In numerous interviews with the police and media, he struggled to understand how such a horrible crime could occur in broad daylight in a busy area of the city. He became an active advocate for the investigation, regularly appearing on German television to appeal for information about his son's killer. As the investigation moved into its second month, detectives began exploring potential connections to other unsolved cases across Europe. The peculiar nature of the crime, particularly the surgical precision of the mutilations, suggested that this might not have been the killer's first offense. Investigators reached out to law enforcement agencies across Germany and neighboring countries, searching for cases with similar characteristics. One lead that garnered significant attention came from Switzerland. In 1997, several witnesses had reported a man matching the suspect's description behaving suspiciously near schools in Basel. Though no crimes were committed, the similarities in the physical description and behavior patterns were striking enough to warrant further investigation. However, like many other leads in the case, this one ultimately led to a dead end. The forensic evidence continued to provide tantalizing clues. Analysis of the blood traces found on the plastic bag left at the scene revealed something interesting. The killer had cut himself during the attack. This meant that investigators had access to the perpetrator's DNA, making it all the more frustrating that they couldn't find a match in any database. The blood type was determined to be A positive, and specific genetic markers suggested the killer was likely of European descent. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the killer's apparent knowledge of the underpass's layout. The maintenance room where Tristan's body was found wasn't immediately visible to passers-by, suggesting the perpetrator was familiar with the location. This led investigators to interview dozens of railway workers, maintenance personnel, and others who might have had reason to know about the room's existence. Again, these inquiries produced no viable suspects. By the summer of 1998, investigators had compiled a detailed psychological profile of the killer. According to criminal psychologists, the perpetrator was likely a white male between 20 and 30 years old, intelligent, and methodical. The level of planning involved in the crime, combined with the surgical precision of the mutilations, suggested someone with significant self-control and possibly medical knowledge. The profile indicated that the killer likely lived or worked in the Frankfurt area and might have had a connection to the medical field or anatomy studies. The profile also suggested something else that troubled investigators: the likelihood that the killer would strike again. The ritualistic nature of the mutilations and the apparent planning involved were indicators of a potentially serial offender. This created a sense of urgency in the investigation and led to increased surveillance in areas around schools and train stations throughout Frankfurt. In September 1998, 6 months after the murder, investigators received what seemed to be a promising lead. A teacher at a medical school in Mainz, about 40 kilometers from Frankfurt, reported that one of their former students had exhibited concerning behavior and matched the physical description of the suspect. The student had dropped out of the program several months before Tristan's murder and had been known to make disturbing comments about human anatomy. However, after thorough investigation, including DNA comparison, this lead too was eliminated. The investigation was further complicated by several false confessions. Between 1998 and 2000, 5 different individuals came forward claiming responsibility for Tristan's murder. Each was thoroughly investigated, and all were eventually proven to be false. Criminal psychologists noted that high-profile cases like Tristan's often attract false confessions from individuals seeking attention or suffering from mental illness. One of the most significant developments came in late 1999 when investigators received an anonymous letter that contained details about the crime that hadn't been released to the public. The letter, written in German but with several grammatical errors, suggesting the writer might not be a native speaker, described specific aspects of the mutilations that only the killer could have known. Forensic analysis of the paper and handwriting provided new leads, but despite extensive investigation, the author was never identified. The case took another turn when investigators discovered that several items were missing from Tristan's possession when his body was found. His house keys and a small amount of money were never recovered, suggesting the killer might have taken them as trophies, a behavior often associated with serial offenders. This detail added weight to the theory that the perpetrator might have committed other crimes, either before or after Tristan's murder. By 2000, the initial investigation had generated over 15,000 pages of documents, included interviews with more than 2,000 people, and cost millions of Deutsche Marks. Despite this massive effort, investigators seemed no closer to identifying Tristan's killer than they had been on the day of the murder. The case began to grow cold, though it was never officially classified as such. The impact on the community remained profound. The underpass where Tristan was murdered became a site of remembrance, with local residents regularly leaving flowers and candles in memory of the young boy whose life was so brutally cut short. The case also led to significant changes in security measures around Frankfurt's schools and public transportation hubs, with increased police presence and the installation of security cameras in previously unmonitored areas. In 2002, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine the biological evidence collected at the crime scene. The new analysis provided additional genetic markers from the killer's blood, but still no match was found in any available database. The enhanced DNA profile was shared with law enforcement agencies across Europe, but this broader search also failed to produce results. Bernd Brübach, Tristan's father, continued his tireless efforts to keep the case in the public eye. In numerous interviews and public appearances, he spoke about his son's life and the devastating impact of his death. He established a small foundation in Tristan's name, dedicated to raising awareness about child safety and supporting families affected by violent crime. Tragically, Bernd passed away in 2015, never knowing who had taken his son's life. The case garnered renewed attention in 2017 when investigators announced they were exploring potential connections to other unsolved murders in Germany and neighboring countries. Using advanced criminal profiling techniques and improved DNA analysis, they began reviewing cold cases from the 1990s and early 2000s, looking for similarities in victim selection, methodology, or forensic evidence that might link to Tristan's murder. The 2017 review of cold cases brought several interesting possibilities to light. Among them was a series of unsolved assaults near train stations in northern Germany between 1995 and 1997. While none of these cases involved murder, the targeting of young victims in public transportation areas showed enough similarities to warrant further investigation. However, without DNA evidence from these earlier cases to compare with the sample from Tristan's murder, investigators couldn't establish a definitive link. One of the most significant developments came in 2018, when investigators began utilizing genetic genealogy techniques that had helped solve cases like the Golden State Killer in the United States. The killer's DNA profile was run through expanded European databases, searching for potential familial matches that might lead to the perpetrator. While this process identified several promising leads, none ultimately led to the identification of Tristan's murderer. The case took another interesting turn when a retired forensic psychiatrist came forward with a new theory about the killer's background. Based on the precision of the mutilations and specific aspects of the crime scene, he suggested that the perpetrator might have had experience in veterinary medicine rather than human medicine. This theory led investigators to review records of veterinary students and practitioners who had been in the Frankfurt area in 1998, adding another layer to the already complex investigation. In 2019, investigators made public previously unreleased details about items found at the crime scene, hoping to generate new leads. Among these was a distinctive fiber pattern found on Tristan's clothing that didn't match anything he owned. Analysis suggested it came from a specific type of camouflage jacket manufactured in Eastern Europe in the mid-1990s. This detail aligned with witness descriptions of the suspect's clothing and suggested a possible connection to Eastern European military or paramilitary organizations. The investigation also benefited from advances in digital forensics. Old security camera footage from nearby businesses, previously considered too grainy for useful analysis, was enhanced using modern technology. While the quality improvement wasn't dramatic, investigators were able to identify several additional individuals who had been in the area around the time of the murder. These persons of interest were systematically tracked down and interviewed, though none proved to be the killer. One particularly intriguing aspect of the case that received renewed attention was the killer's apparent familiarity with the Frankfurt-Höchst train station area. Investigators created detailed timelines of construction projects, maintenance work, and renovations in the area during the 1990s, hoping to identify anyone who might have had legitimate reason to know about the maintenance room where Tristan's body was found. This effort generated a list of several hundred people who had worked in or around the station, each of whom needed to be investigated. The psychological profile of the killer was also updated based on modern behavioral analysis techniques. Experts now believed that the perpetrator likely had a history of smaller crimes before escalating to murder. The level of confidence displayed in committing such a brazen crime in broad daylight suggested previous experience with violent or high-risk behavior. This new profile led investigators to review cases of assault, harassment, and stalking in the Frankfurt area from the mid-1990s. In 2020, a new witness came forward with an account that added another layer to the mystery. The witness, who had been reluctant to speak with police in 1998 due to their own legal troubles at the time, reported seeing two men acting suspiciously near the underpass the day before the murder. They appeared to be studying the area's layout and timing the intervals between passing trains. While this information couldn't be independently verified after so many years, it suggested the possibility that the crime involved more than one perpetrator. The case has continued to captivate the public's attention and frustrate investigators. The combination of broad daylight, multiple witnesses, forensic evidence, and yet no resolution makes it one of Germany's most perplexing unsolved murders. The fact that someone could commit such a horrific crime in such a public place and effectively vanish has led to numerous theories about the killer's identity and background. Some investigators believe the perpetrator may have left Germany shortly after the murder, possibly returning to Eastern Europe based on the clothing evidence and certain forensic indicators. Others theorize that the killer may have died in the years since the murder, taking the truth to the grave. Still others maintain that the perpetrator remains in Germany, perhaps even in Frankfurt, having managed to escape detection despite the extensive investigation. The case remains open, with a dedicated team still actively investigating leads as they emerge. The killer's DNA profile is regularly run through expanded databases as new samples are added. Advanced forensic techniques continue to be applied to the evidence as technology improves. The Frankfurt Police Department maintains that solving Tristan's murder remains a priority, even after more than 2 decades. Tristan Brübach's case serves as a haunting reminder of how even the most public of crimes can remain unsolved despite extensive evidence and witness accounts. It continues to influence German law enforcement procedures and has led to improved security measures in public spaces across the country. The case has also become a significant study subject for criminologists and forensic psychologists who use it to better understand the behavior patterns of violent offenders and the challenges of investigating crimes committed in public spaces. While justice has yet to be served for Tristan Brübach, his case has left an indelible mark on German criminal history and continues to drive advances in investigative techniques. The hope remains that one day, whether through advances in technology, new witness information, or other developments, the person responsible for this horrific crime will be identified and brought to justice. Until then, Tristan's case stands as one of Germany's most notorious unsolved murders, a tragic reminder of a young life cut short and a killer who managed to commit an unthinkable crime in broad daylight and vanish without a trace.